Hello, this is Racer445 here for CG Tuts Plus, and this is the first video in my SciFi prop workflow series. This is definitely not a series for beginners. If you're a beginner, I recommend you shut this video off because you're going to end up being very confused. This is more for your advanced user who's looking to further their workflow by maybe studying somebody else's. So anyway, going into Max here, I just want to point out that I have some buttons above my modifiers panel. Those are Edit Poly, Bend, very helpful, Taper, Skew, I use that a lot, Spherify, which is very useful for making holes and stuff. Then we've got this one here, which is Relax, which, as you can imagine, is probably very helpful in a lot of cases. We've got Push, which is basically kind of the opposite, I suppose. We've got Symmetry, and you're going to see me use this a lot. You can model half of one thing, and then you can mirror it to make the other half. This is a custom modifier called Edge Checks. If you can see what it's doing there, you might be able to imagine how it's useful. It can kind of automatically add in control edges for you. It's kind of buggy though. I have Unwrap UVW, I have Tessellate, which when set to quad mode and zero tension, you can automatically make your mesh more dense. And then I've got Turbo Smooth. Pretty standard stuff. Now I press the far right button underneath my modifiers panel and you can change the buttons there. You can also enable them if you don't have them already enabled. So I'm also going to show you some selection tools that I have. I have IC Shape installed, which is the Illusion Catalyst tools, as well as Soulburn scripts. Yeah, I don't use that at all, but I highly recommend you have it. So I've got Control W set to Edge Ring, like you have here, like you see there. I've got Control E to Edge Loop, and then I've got this tool installed with IC Shape called Span. It allows you to select the start and end of an edge loop, and then you can press a button. I have it set to Control Q, and it'll automatically bridge the gap between it and select all the edges between those. Very useful. Allows you to quickly select just a small region of an edge loop or edge ring. It's kind of buggy, but it does work most of the time, as long as you don't have any modifiers on top of it. I've also got text tools installed, amazing UV unwrapping tool set. I've also got the Chugnut UV window installed, which allows you to get to your essential UV tools a lot quicker, and has some more stuff in there that's helpful. Right, so that about covers it for the tools that I use. So here I've got a blockout of the model that we're going to make. I didn't cover making this blockout because it's something that's so simple that anybody could really do it. There's no need to explain how I did it. So I'm just going to start out by adding an Edit Poly modifier on top of one of my blockout meshes here. This way I can easily revert back to my blockout mesh at any time, and that's especially useful for making the low poly mesh that we use to project the normals onto. So now I'm just going to start here adding into some control edges, something that's very simple. Just using Connect a lot, as well as Span to just move certain parts of a loop up and down. So I'm just going to keep going onto that until I get it the way I see fit. And that looks pretty slick, but I'm just going to make it so that some of the edges are, well, better. I don't know how to describe it, but now I'm making this edge hard, which if you notice here, I'm going to be using Cut to make this into all quads and cap it off. It's not necessarily because if you have an angle on a perfectly flat surface, it's not going to do any harm, but I figure just do it for cleanliness purposes. So I'm just going to continue here to add in and tweak my edge loops that I've already done, and you can see that that mesh looks pretty smooth. I want this nice edge bevel where the parts connect of this main body of this cart. So I just use this modifier called Shell, which is something that's excruciatingly useful, especially for car bodies and whatnot. And basically it'll add a nice thickness to your flat basic models. So now I'm just going to continue working on this base mesh down here at the bottom on an Edit Poly modifier again. And if you can notice on the concept down there, there's this little door or a panel or something. And it's going to end up being a sliding like pull-out door in the end. So what I've done here is I've just duplicated one of the polys on the side, pulled it out, now modifying it so it's fitting the shape of the concept roughly. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of select some of these polys here, delete them, and we're just going to use bridge a lot to get this integrated back into our base mesh. One thing of note that I do a lot is I like to model in far too much into my high poly, just because it looks impressive. Particularly, I mean, screws, panels, text, stuff that should be floating or done in Photoshop. I like to model it in because it looks nice and impressive when you render it out. Even if it doesn't make the cut, even if it's easier to do it with a normal map filter, sometimes I'll just do it anyway. So now here I've added in an edge loop in between that panel that I just made, and I pulled it in so that way it gets that nice indent. Right, so now I'm just adding some more support edges, getting stuff into quads. I'm going to be doing this for a little bit, but it's kind of interesting how I tackle some flow problems and getting edges to be beveled correctly. Right, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time here tackling some flow issues. You don't need to watch this if you don't want to, but it might help you if you have trouble with a certain shape. I don't know. Now while that's going and while I'm doing this, I want to talk a little bit about the concept. The concept that I'm working from that's been always on top in this corner was drawn by my buddy Toby. That's how you pronounce his name. Tobe. His username is Mindseeker22. And he's just sketched out this little concept. It's nice and clear, very crisp, easy to follow. That's the key here. I intentionally had him leave out a lot of the details so that you could get creative and figure things out on your own. Because a lot of times people will make stuff from tutorials that are exactly like the tutorial item. That's fine, but I wanted you people to get a little bit creative and figure things out for yourself. It was also based on one of the concepts from Paul Richards' site, which is autodestruct.com, and I recommend you check those out because they're very, very clear and easy to follow. Right, so I fixed up the flow problems that I was having, and I added a symmetry modifier so I could work on both sides at the same time. Save some time a little bit. So now I'm just going to move on to this top section here, which I kind of already started doing, but it's not perfect. So I'm just slap symmetry modifier on here so I can work on both sides at the same time, again. And I use symmetry a lot. You may notice that I use it for almost everything, but I will add in some unique details just so I can break up that symmetry so it does not look blatantly mirrored. And we'll use some symmetry on the low poly too so we can save UV space. So I'm going to be doing this thing, I guess you call it double smooth. That's what I've been calling it for a while. Basically what you do is you make your mesh really dense and then you put your turbo smooth on so that you can get those nice edge bevels really quickly. I like to do it with smoothing groups and using the turbo smooth by smoothing groups option. So what we can do is we can add in and keep shapes hard looking without manually defining edge loops, which will speed things up quite a lot. It'll just help you make stuff faster, I suppose, is the best way. And you can kind of see me here defining some smooth groups, or in Maya you call them hard and soft edges. But anyway, you can see me sort of defining the smoothing groups and where I want to keep the shapes hard, or where I want to keep the roundness going. It's not like a tessellate, like just using a straight tessellate modifier to make the mesh really dense, but instead it keeps your mesh flow so that you can get round shapes as well as hard shapes. Where with tessellate you would just ignore the mesh flow and add in edges wherever. So now I'm kind of adding in this little bevel here, and this is really messy, but I've gone and fixed it. So here you can see me defining the smooth groups for the sides, the various sides of this. And I need to clean up this area around here, and I'm looking in the wrong place, of course. But I'm cleaning up this little corner, making it look right, or at least as right as I possibly can. And also I use a lot of edge ring to select stuff, and if you notice, I've been using edge loop and edge ring and right clicking and going to convert to face or convert to vertex to select stuff. That'll speed stuff up a lot, especially if you have a key to do that. But you don't need a key because it's on your quad menu if you right click. So I'm chamfering this to add in a more of a beveled kind of shape onto this edge, kind of following the concept. You can't see the concept too well, I'll post it up, but kind of get those hard edges in around this handle. Right, so I'm just going to be tweaking this edge loop a lot, get it more towards the shape that I'm looking for, and also add in smoothing groups so that it will smooth correctly when I apply both the turbo smooth modifiers. You can see them on the top here, and I keep tweaking them on and off, but they're not always on. Speed stuff up a bit. So I'm going to tweak these edges so that they're more smooth looking, because if you see down there at the bottom near that panel, when eventually we pan down there, you'll see that it's kind of not smooth. It's got that lip that I don't want. So now I'm also going to use chamfer a bit so I can keep them in one smooth group. It's an easy way to do that. Play with this edge, play with push, etc. Now also I've added a symmetry so I can work on both sides at the same time. Pretty simple stuff. I need to define these shapes down here. It's not too difficult, but it's not smooth as it is, so I need to do that. Checking my music, it's also very, very important for me at least to have some music playing in the background, good music at least, not just random music obviously, but something that helps me work. And I'm adding this edge loop in. The video just went crazy, but you can see that the hard edges are starting to get defined towards this angle. And we've got most of the cart subdivided. And also I want that nice little lip, so I'm going to add a shell modifier and tweak the extrude amounts. And you can see that now we have that nice bevel on the edge of our parts. Looks fantastic. So I'm adding in more edges at the back here so that we can keep the shape. I also done it at the front earlier. But now that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to start working on the next part, which is going to be very simple. However, I want it a particular way. So I'm going to manually add in some edges and also do double smooth just because I can. Make it a little bit more dense before I add in the final turbo smooth. So now here I'm going to add in these little bevels. Make this sort of a drawer, I guess you could say. I'm going to add in some handles later too, so it looks more like a drawer and not just like some random bevels. So you can see here I'm adding in some more edges so it'll be more defined as a shape. And those all have their own smooth groups. Right, so that's going to about end this section of this tutorial video. And you can see that most of the mesh is sub-D'd, but it's not very detailed. So I'm going to start by modeling one of the actual details that I'm going to put onto it. I've just reset the max scene to default, get it all nice and blank slate to work on. And I'm going to start shaping our handle. Now this handle is based off a handle from a computer case that I've seen multiple times. And I'm going to just duplicate this to get it back in, just kind of get this indent to where you would put your hand to grab onto the latch. I'm going to bridge it so it's all right. It's all modeled in. I'm using symmetry to get everything nice and simple so I don't have to do everything on both sides. So I'm going to get this outside edge by just using extrude. And then I'm going to be doing double smooth again. What a surprise. It's so easy. Right, so now I'm just going to select this inside area. And I selected a bit too much here. But also I'm saving this out as its own max file. I'm going to merge it later. So you can see me now removing some selections that I did wrong, and I'm beveling this in, making it more smooth, just by using scale. Pretty simple. So now I'm going to actually make the handle itself, not the indented bit. And I'm just doing this by using its own plane and just modeling it on its own. And I'm going to end up using shell again, which is an extremely useful modifier. Adding more edge loops. This is kind of going to be a round handle, and I'm just going to play around with it a little bit. And that's not particularly the shape that I wanted, so I'm going to do the other way. I'm also going to make it only half. Again, use symmetry. It's a fantastic tool. So now I'm going to use shell, get it nice and thick looking. You could also use face extrude probably. And I'm going to use bend. I'm going to tweak it a lot here. I'm going to change the angle first off, get it roughly how I want it. I'll change the center, and then I'm going to rotate the gizmo so that it will look proper. Right. So now I'm going to merge this into our scene. Just merge both objects, use C material. And then we can rotate it and place it how we want it. And just use scale. It doesn't matter for what scale you use when you're modeling these details on their own, but you're going to have to scale them down. So I'm going to use symmetry here, and you can see that that looks a lot more like a drawer now with those handles. And so I'm just going to play around with the width of these, the placement. Try and get it more equal. I think I like that the most, so I'm going to keep it that way. And so now I need to add some more visual interest down here in between the handles. So I'm just going to make this mesh a little bit more dense and start defining some shapes here. So I'm going to end up doing kind of a bunch of dots. You can see them here. And I'm going to end up making them this pattern right here. It's going to be the final pattern for this. And I'm just going to use extrude and bevel to get them indented here. And I'm going to scale them using vertex scale, because vertex scale, for whatever reason, works as a group and not as individual polygons. And I'm going to scale them so that they're perfect squares, so that when they're subdivided, they're going to be subdivided down into circles. And I'm going to add in edge loops here so that they look more hard and not so they're just blobby. Right, so I'm just going to scale them in and move them a bit. I recommend you turn on ignore back facing for this so you don't accidentally move anything else. I've done that before. It's not fun, but I didn't have it on and I didn't do anything wrong. So there it is. There's my little details on that. And I'm just going to make this a little bit more dense and add in this little light strip. This is just going to be normaled in on the low poly. Like I said, it's very important to think about your low poly when you're making your high poly. And that's not looking good as it is. It's indented, but it's not perfect. So I'm going to add in some edge loops. I'm trying double smooth, but I'm not a big fan of it right now. So, oh, I guess I did do it. Never mind. So I just use double smooth again. And I'm going to add in some, or at least I'm going to try to add in another light strip down at the bottom. I'm just going to play with it. As I said, play with some details. If you don't like them, you don't have to use them. You can always do everything temporary by just using edit poly. You can always use more edit poly modifiers, although Max might crash more because it's not very stable. But that's aside the point. I'm just going to keep adding some bigger details into here. Make the mesh a little bit more detailed, but not super fine yet. I'll do that at the end. So I'm just adding some edge loops here. Define the shapes more, helping them keep more solid. Also making stuff more round. Making room for more edge loops. And you can see here that I'm just making more edge loops and tweaking them to fit the shape. It's always good to have kind of a vision in your head of how you want stuff to look instead of directly following your concept. Although I recommend you follow your concept as close as possible, take some artistic liberty. You know, make stuff how you think looks nice. So I'm just going to scale this down because I didn't like it super wide like that. So I'm going to start on this little front section above the wheels, or rather what the wheels are attached to. And I kind of want it to be a bin like that you would dispose stuff into, a trash can if you will. I guess my intention for this model is to be sort of like a tool bin, a construction bin or something, or medic bin, medic cart. Those are always popular and easy to texture. Lots of color in that. A distinct color scheme, I mean. So I'm going to start by beveling this. This is kind of going to be just a bin. So it's going to have a door or a sliding bit on the top. And so I'm going to do this floating, this kind of outline. And I'm going to be using some various modifiers to try and get some more depth to this. You know, it didn't really work that well. I'm just going to manually end up doing it by selecting parts of this, scaling it in, moving it how it sees fit. And also I used Make Planar there to make sure that it is all on the same angle. That's another tool that's very useful. Right, so I'm just going to rotate it so it fits more with the original shape. It gets on the right angle. And I'm going to move it a little bit so that the render will look nicer. It'll look more like one part. And I'm going to scale in these sections so that it's nice and even, so that one part is not wider than the other. And then I'm going to add in some more loops, and I'm going to move it up, just kind of change it up a little bit so it doesn't look so symmetrical. This is going to be one of the things that I do to break the symmetry of this model so that it doesn't look so mirrored. It doesn't look so obviously the same. So I'm going to start on some wheels. The wheels in the front are going to be very, very simple. Kind of looking like those round wheels that you always see on swivel chairs and whatnot. Very cheap rubber wheels, but yet very durable. I kind of want this whole thing to look like it will last through anything. But I also want to use common day parts. Even though this is sci-fi, stuff doesn't change that much. These same cheap rubber wheels will probably be used. So I'm just going to add in some more big details, like this big bevel here on the side. And that doesn't look terrible, but I want it to be scaled down more and fit more with this little indent. If you notice, there is not any room actually for these wheels to move. They're meshing with the actual body of the cart. That's fine, because in our texture we're just going to make that black and nobody's going to notice. Or we can model in that little indent in our low poly, and also nobody will probably notice. So I'm going to scale in this loop, and I'm going to add in some more details here. I'm just going to use bevel, and I'm going to make this big round detail here, and I'm almost done with the front wheels now. I'm going to play around with making some more, like a tread, a tire tread, more of a sci-fi tire tread, a simplistic tire tread, rather than your modern day tire tread that's strategically designed to be grippy. So if you see here, I've duplicated out some of the faces from this round section of the tire, and I've used Turbo Smooth on it to make it more dense. Then I've selected all the edge rings, just one edge ring rather, and then I selected all the edge loops using Control E, as I do. And then I beveled it out using extrude edge, and then I've scaled it down after I've turbo smoothed it. So that did that tire tread pretty well. So now I'm going to try and make sort of a generic detail, but these details aren't going to get used at all. I'm going to end up deleting these, but I like to always make some sort of generic detail anyway, and then just kind of keep it off to the side in case I ever need it used later. So you can see I brought this in, just kind of made this bevel, simple bevel, and I'm making the edges hard now, and scaling it down, placing it how I want, although these are going to get deleted anyway. But hey, if you're not going to use them, you can always delete them. Hopefully we're not sculpting here. So I'm just going to delete these details, just play with them a little bit more, I guess. And as you see, I'm changing them a bit, using symmetry, making them more of a snap, definitely. And so now I've moved it out. I'm changing where it's being placed. If you want to place details very easily, you can use the object placer in the Solburn scripts, which is probably the best object placer script out there, in my opinion. I think it's called Object Painter too. Great for grass and all that such. So now I'm going to add in sort of more of a panel line down here around the wheels. Just get some more details going. And now here I'm going to use the snaps instead of on the panel on the side where I was going to use the snaps. And I'm going to need to change the width of these later, but that's not super important. And I'm going to play with the handle. And I'm going to end up moving the handle out to the side here, which is going to end up being a drawer instead of being a weird panel, which I was just going to do earlier. And I'm just going to use one of the handles instead of two. You don't need more than one handle to open a drawer like that anyway. It's not large enough. So I'm going to use symmetry to get it on both sides, as usual. Move it out. And there we go. We got the handle on the drawer. So now I'm going to make another sort of more industrial handle for this kind of waste bin on the front. And I'm going to be just using double smooth, as usual, because it's simple. I'm sure there's a proper name for that technique, but I don't know it, so I'm not going to bother. And I've used shell to give it some quick thickness, instead of just using extrude face, or similar. And I'm going to place it. Now, if you're paying attention, I've used instants for these handles when cloning them, so that way I can work on all the handles at the same time. If you can imagine, this is very, very useful for making low polys of stuff, so that you can only make one low poly for all of the handles, and it will automatically apply itself to the rest. So I'm going to play around with some handles onto this. I didn't really like this, so I'm moving it up to the top, as you can see here, with instants again. And this panel is going to end up being pull-offable. Removable is the proper term. I don't know what I was thinking when I said pull-offable. But yeah, that's going to be that handle for the top. And I'm going to end up doing kind of a plate at the top that's going to say warning, as well as one for the side. But I might have removed that at the end. I don't remember exactly. I don't have the render in front of me. So I'm going to just play around with some details. Nothing is going to be exact at this point. I'm just going to start playing around with it some more. If you see here, I've got it more dense than I probably need it to be. But I'm going to add in this kind of tab onto the top of this. But I thought this looked too much like a file folder in Windows, if you've noticed the icons. So I ended up removing that and just making it a flat kind of plate, a bumper sticker looking plate. And you're going to see that in just a second. I'm going to use symmetry so I don't have to delete that detail. And so then we just got this kind of generic plate right there. So I'm going to scale it down, make it more dense, and there we go. We've got sort of a plate here, which is going to sit floating. I didn't add any kind of fasteners to that in the end. I probably should have, but that would have taken a lot of effort, and I don't like effort. So I'm going to add in some more details into here. I ended up, I think I just did it using floating. Yeah, I'm just doing it through floating. I could have probably modeled it in. You could see that my mesh was fairly dense there, but I didn't feel like it, I suppose. So I'm adding in more floating details here. These are kind of going to be sort of like a vent. We're going to say this has some sort of cooling or power supply or something in the back that needs to be cooled. So underneath that panel is like an engine or something, I don't know. A generator. So now here's a control panel that I'm going to be modeling. And this is on the concept, if you notice, and it's got this big long LCD screen on the top and 2 buttons underneath it. I like that a lot, so I'm going to be adding that in, as well as this sort of rack mount looking screw system on the side. So I'm just going to add in some holes for these screws, but I'm not actually going to put any screws in them because you're never going to end up seeing into those. And I suppose if you're doing this for film, you would probably end up putting screws in there, but I'm not, so haha. So I'm just going to define some more of these hard edges using Inset. Inset's a fantastic tool as well. And I'm going to be tweaking this a bit more, making more solid in certain areas, but end up looking round on the corners here, the top corners. I quite like that look. I kept it even though it was kind of a mistake. So on to making the buttons and this little LCD screen. The buttons are just going to be made using bevel, as you can see here. And then I'm going to duplicate the face up to make the actual buttons themselves. I'm using Face Extrude, which is a fantastic tool. I'm going to be making this more dense so that they're perfect squares. Or rather, not perfect squares now. And so that using Face Extrude, we can make it as tall as we want, as thick as we want. And then I can use Turbo Smooth to make it nice and round. And I quite like that a lot. So now I need to add in some more edge loops here on the actual panel itself to make sure that they're about the same shape as the buttons. So they're not too round, too soft, too hard, too square. And here I have some nasty N-gons. Everybody's going to hate me for that, but they didn't affect the shading at all, so I kept them. And now I'm going to be adding in the LCD screen, making stuff more wide as need be. Trying to fit more to the concept because I quite like the concept, the little LCD panel screen thing. So now I'm just going to shape out this big screen here. And I'm going to manually actually shape this out using Inset because I feel it gives me more control. Bevel didn't really work out that well. I just tried it there. I didn't really like how it turned out. It made some edges too hard. So now I'm going to manually add in everything, all the control edges, and try and make everything mesh well with those little screws. There are a lot of N-gons on this, but you can't really help that a lot. It looked fine anyway, so whatever. N-gons aren't really a big problem. A lot of people like to make them out as being the devil, but I don't find them a problem at all unless you're making them on curved faces, and even then it's not really that big of a deal because all it's going to do is going to make them down into tris anyway. So I'm just going to place this little control panel. If you can notice, I've kept it off to the side there just so I can modify that as an instance so that I don't have to modify just my one copy of it. So I'm going to start on these rear wheels. And I've duplicated, as you can see, those ribbed tread from the front wheel. And I'm going to scale it up more to the size of the original wheel. And get it roughly placed how I want it to. Change the thickness and whatever as need be. Now these wheels are just simple blockouts, so I'm going to end up replacing them now. And I used shell there to make the tread thicker, and you'll see why later. So now I'm modifying these blockouts to be more of a rim for that tread. That's why I wanted to make it thicker, that tread, I mean. And I'm going to use bevel and inset and whatnot to give it sort of a shape. Now I'm basing these wheels off an RC car wheel, actually, I found. I don't have a reference picture for you, but they're pretty cool, and they're relatively standard. So here I'm just making an axle, making them directly attached, and I'm using chamfer to kind of make the edges more round. So now I'm just using inset and cut. You're going to see what I'm going to do here. There's this particular shape that I want it to look like that looks very futuristic. So I'm just going to select these verts here and get them lined up with one of the edges here on the side and connect them, and then scale them down. And it's very important to make sure that you have ignore back facing on, but even though you might have ignore back facing on, it still might act up. So make sure you watch out for that. So I fixed that up and make this all into quads using some very tricky edge placement. You can see I got into all quads, which is actually quite an achievement there. And I'm going to be using double smooth. What a surprise, because I didn't add in enough edges. I didn't add in enough sides to this circle because I didn't plan on making this original shape onto the side. So you can see that it's still a little bit too hard. So I'm going to use the smoothing groups to my advantage and make it look nice and round. As you see here, boom, there we go. That's exactly how I wanted it to look. So I'm going to scale up this tread as well as I need to place it better. Alright, so now I'm just adjusting the symmetry on the wheels because I use symmetry a whole lot. So I'm going to go back here, just take a look at the placement, make sure everything's perfect. And we're going to end up having to remodel these wheels anyway for the low poly. So, whatever. So I'm just going to hide all my instanced geometry here. And I'm going to get to work on this part of the mesh, because I'm going to be making a little hose and a generator type bit on the back. So I'm going to be selecting just this edge loop here. Span wasn't working. I don't know why. It's kind of buggy. I told you that already though. So I said create shape from path. That's a really helpful tool. It'll allow you to make a spline from any edge selection. Which here I've got my spline. Play with it so it looks more smooth, and I've said enable in viewport for rendering. And I'm just going to play with it so it looks better. Right, so we've about got it now. So I'm going to add an edit poly on top of that, and we can manually adjust everything. So I'm going to make this about as dense as I want it to be, so everything's about equal. So I'm going to select all of the edge loops, except for the ones on the end, and I'm going to bevel them out so that now it kind of looks like a hose, like a vacuum hose. And we can go back to the edit spline properties and adjust the thickness if need be, which I did need to. And now I'm adjusting it so everything is proportionate to how it needs to be. It's not weirdly proportioned. And I'm going to play with some freeform deformers in a second here. Now the FFD deformers are a set of modifiers that will present you with a grid, and you will be able to deform your mesh here by selecting certain control points. And you can also adjust those control points as need be and select different volumes. And that's very, very useful for slightly deforming things that maybe aren't perfect, or just for adding some sort of natural flow to stuff. And also here I'm going to be adding in this little pipe, which is where those kind of vacuum looking hoses will attach to the main body. Because we can't just have those hoses randomly floating, we've got to have them connect to something visually. Now these little pipes are going to have to be modeled in, unfortunately. And I don't like modeling in a whole lot, on the low poly particularly. I like doing it on the high poly, but not on the low. Go figure. I don't like adding unnecessarily triangles, but I guess this is a necessity, so whatever. So I'm playing with the deformer and making it line up correctly. The low poly might be a little bit painstaking when I do this, but we'll get it done. Always do. So I've used symmetry again to make the hose on both sides. And I'm going to also add in some more symmetry defined stuff on the back, make it look a little bit less mirrored. I'm going to add in more of those little nice heat vent looking things from the front drawer. And as you see, I made my mesh quite dense, and I'm just making it more even, as you'll see here. So have a look at this. Pretty decent. I'm going to have to do it by group. Get everything scaled down as need be. And also, for whatever reason, Max decided to make duplicate vertices, which is an unfortunate bug. I don't know why that happens, but we can get around that by just welding everything by a very, very, very tiny radius. So here I have adjusted my little holes here in the back so that they're pretty equal. So now I'm just going to bevel them in, add in control edges as need be. Also define the hard and soft edges, smoothing groups rather, so that they look more like holes. And there we go. I quite like that a lot. That's a nice result. So I'm just having a look through the model, and I'm going to duplicate this handle in the back. I'm going to play with it quite a bit. So I'm going to scale this up quite a bit, and it's going to end up being like a rear bumper of sorts. And I've taken quite a lot of artistic liberty, actually, and deviating quite a lot from this concept. If you compare my model to the concept down in the corner, you'll see that they're quite different, actually, in a lot of places, although they're roughly similar. So, you know, take some artistic liberty when making stuff, but don't blow it out of proportion, which is pretty important, and it's the skill that you kind of need to learn as an artist. So yeah, here I've been making this rear bumper, and I'm just going to add in some holes in the back so it's not so boring. These holes have no purpose whatsoever other than to look cool, and I do that quite a lot. Not everything needs a purpose, but everything needs a purpose, I suppose. It's good to have some sort of dumb reason why things are there, even if it's the worst reason you can possibly have. Just, you know, think of a reason. Give things some purpose, even if they have no purpose. I guess that's the best way to put it. So here I'm adding in another edge bevel here on the front. More panel lines, I should say. Right, so just having a look through everything again. It's starting to look a lot more detailed now. It looks more like an actual model now, not just some blocky thing. So guess what? I'm using symmetry again for this pipe, which I'm going to be using this as an instance quite a lot. And I'm going to start defining sort of this rear power generator thing, I suppose you could call it. I'm just going to start by making the connection here from the hose to whatever it's going to be. And I'm going to add like a power cell on the back here by just using a cylinder, and I'm going to cut in some details later. So I'm just going to place this how I see fit, probably in the center, I suppose. Or I can just make half, as I probably will, and use symmetry, as I usually do. So I'm just going to bevel these edges a bit. Just delete extra polygons, use symmetry, and bevel this corner. And add in some more edge loops. And so you can see here I'm selecting some edges which I'm going to use to add sort of this little indent. I always like this shape. I've done this quite a lot on SciFi things, particularly on cylinders. Just defining sort of a panel on round stuff. A hard panel on round things is pretty cool. So I'm just adding in some more hard edges. It's starting to look pretty good and make stuff more dense. And I'm going to put a edit poly on top of the symmetry, and I'm going to add in kind of like a power indicator. If you ever seen sort of like the MacBook battery lights that are on the battery to indicate charge, I wanted to do something similar to that. And I'm adding in some loops. That looks pretty decent. I quite like that a lot. It doesn't really have too much of a point, but I like to think it does. So we're going to use these pipes again, connect the power cell, I guess you could call it, to the main body. And pretty simple stuff. So now we need some way to connect these pipes to the main body without leaving a big blank space underneath it. So I don't particularly know what I'm doing here. I think this might have been a temporary thing. Which, yes, it was. So, anyway, I'm going to make a plane and start by making like a little converter box underneath it. If you ever seen some bits in like car engines that look like this, well, then you will see where my inspiration comes from. I'll kind of explain that as I go on. But that's not really important. Right, so now I've just started to define this kind of back fuel converter type shape. I don't know what you'd call it. I'm just making up names for it so it sounds like it has a function. So I've made it kind of round and I'm giving it skew here so it doesn't look so bland and round. And again, I used shift drag to make shapes very easily. That's probably the best tool in the entire Max tool set, is shift drag. And for every reason, my skew modifier is acting up, so I just redid it real quick. Or at least I'm redoing it now, rather. And I'm just selecting what the only what I want to be skewed, and then adding the skew modifier on top, which will make it so it only modifies what is selected, which is pretty neat, pretty good function. So now I think I'm about done with that. So I'm going to go on to adding some details. So here I'm going to model one of the big details that I use, which is going to be sort of a nut, sort of your fastener, your bolt. And so I just started out with a 6-sided cylinder, and then I am just starting to shape it into sort of a nut-looking shape. What we want is we want this round shape, and you'll see what I mean here once I add in all the loops that I want. You can see how it's kind of got a curve, and I'm going to chamfer it to make that even more apparent. And we want that throughout the entire shape. However, we want this top to be round, so I'm just going to select this by angle and use SciFi, which is going to make it perfectly round. And then delete those faces and just scale it in. Also, I'm going to make this bottom have some edge loops and give it some hardness by adding in edge loops on the side. Right, so I'm going to use double smooth to make it a little bit more hard. And you see I've defined the smoothing groups right now. So now I'm going to change the turbo smooth to work by smoothing groups, and then I'm going to add another turbo smooth on top of that. So now we're about ready to place it where we see fit. I tried it on the wheels, I didn't really like it. So if you notice I've got the screws here on the side, and those I did not show being placed because they're pretty easy to place. I pre-made those. I have kind of a Greeble library, I guess you could call it, which has just a bunch of predefined details which I can just merge in at any point. Pretty cool. I've also saved out these nuts to a predetermined Max file, which is pretty nice as well. If you want to easily place these screws, I recommend you use that Object Painter script I was talking about earlier. That'll allow you to just click and place the screws wherever you feel they need to be, instead of having to manually drag them and place them like I am now. So anyway, I'm just going to continue placing these bolts where I feel they should be, without being too excessive. That's one thing, is that when you're using screws or rivets or bolts, well, maybe not rivets because those are supposed to be everywhere, but don't put them everywhere. Make sure there's some empty spots. That's one thing that I see a lot, is that a lot of modelers, when doing sci-fi designs, will end up putting just details everywhere and overcrowding things. When you're making sci-fi, you really want to keep some sort of flat area, especially since this main body of this cart is going to be plastic. There's no need to put a billion panels on everything. So anyway, I'm just putting down some more of these bolts, and I think that's about going to do it. Maybe I'll put some more on these handles. Yeah. Get those attached so that they don't just look glued on. Because when you don't have enough details, it just looks like everything's glued on. But when you have too much, it just looks too busy. That's, I guess, my point that I was trying to get at. I'm not really good at explaining things right now, so apologies. So I'm going to save it out again, and I'm going to merge in these bevels, these generic bevels that I have from my Greeble library. And these are very simple to make. They take probably about 5 minutes each, and I just have them saved out, and they're very useful. So I'm just going to place those as I see fit here in the back, make it kind of look grippy, as if you're supposed to put your boot on this panel and push it with your feet to get some starting leverage, I guess. You know, like those little luggage carts that they use to tote luggage around. So I'm just doing a test render, just to see how everything looks out when rendered. So I've copied this out as an instance, or actually as a copy, I think. And I'm just going to modify it so it's a little bit more dense. And there we go. More dense, more good. And so I'm just going to play around with it and get bent. I'm just trying some details on the wheel, make it so it doesn't just look like a big hunk of plastic. Get something interesting in it, and also the video is real messed up here. But this detail didn't make it in anyway, so I've ended up deleting it. And I've just ended up putting 3 simple screws on the wheel just to make it look interesting at all. So, deleted that, gone. Copying one of the screws here. I'm placing them on the wheels as I see fit. I'm just going to add 3 simple screws. Not a whole lot. There's no really need to do anything super detailed, super complex on the wheels. They're not that big of a deal. So I'm hiding everything except for the small details that we want mirrored. Because if you notice, I only place details on one side of the model. This is because I'm going to be using symmetry to place the details on the rest of it. Right, so I'm just going to finish hiding all of the models I don't want to be mirrored, which are all of the non-small details. And so all of the small details are just left, and I'm going to apply a symmetry. Put it at 0, and there we go. Hide all the instanced models here, and we're ready to render. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!